We are investigating still, continuously, in our program. We have only 100 more sessions to go. This is the fourth in the nature segment. And let's position our imagination for a moment. In ancient times, whenever an efficacious ritual movement was required, human wisdom came to understand that the efficacious pattern was to move in a clockwise circle, to move in such a fashion that the beginning, the very first step, was marked so that the place that you stepped off first was marked, and one went around clockwise and came back to the same part. But in order not to close the circle, one did not step into the initial stepping off space, but turned and pivoted. One made a turn there, and then went back around in the circle counterclockwise and came back to that same space. Then one could step back into the same space, but not close the circle. So that the initial space was like the zero in a cardinal numerical sequence. The zero continued to count because it was preserved. And even though one came back to the space, one came back after a double allowance for the zero to register. The first registering of the zero space was at the beginning, then the clockwise circle, and then the turning before one got to the space, which preserved the zero again, and then one came back around. The third time, one can step into the space and not erase the space by a presence, so that the holiness, the sacredness of the openness of the space was its presence. And by coming back a third time, after twice preserving the sacredness of the openness, gave us the most primordial of all the symbols. And that is that on a feeling-toned, intuitive, imaginative projection, man recognized that there was a double zero of a space in the pattern of making holy. Now, if you pull those two zeros together, you get the infinity sign. And so the hermetic primordiality of the infinity sign is actually the double zero brought together. It's not an Ian Fleming thing that a double zero number is licensed to kill. But it's that a ritual that recognizes and practices a double zero, an infinity, within its completed complex, includes in the completion the preservation consciously, experientially, of the openness of infinity. Now, as we will see in a little while, the presence of infinity within the finite is of the utmost importance. Without that fact, nothing could exist. And we can show this to be mathematically tenable in terms of universal law. Let me give you a page of notes, which is going to go over our heads right now. But we need to hear this kind of language now so that we can come back here. We can return back here. You can listen to these tapes, you can see these videos, and have a copy of this page by next week. This is a high Dharma language way to talk about what we're going to talk about in a very simple, natural, experimental way. Experimenting with bringing our own quality of experience to rise it up to this horizon of recognition ability. Here's a high Dharma language. It's taken from the mathematics of integration. Infinity is not integrable, though infinity is differentiable. Thus the world is finite, that it might be integrable. And its integral proceeds by sets. Sets characterized by symbols. Symbols create sets of images, allowing for imagination to come to a point, a visualization focus, and to the point, a vanishing absorption. The finite quality of the world allows for actuality, for points to occur. Atoms, quarks, particles, molecules, cells. For integration to proceed by ordering sets of points in sequence, which is cardinal, or by ordering sets in consequence, which is ordinal. A transform is needed to converge sets. Transformation deals with functions. The class of measurable functions is larger than the class of continuous functions. They may be discontinuous at every point and still be integrable. Now that's a kind of a high-flown language, a kind of a mathematic mysticism, way in which a 21st century Pythagoras might talk about what is before us. Let's try it in a more easy way. Let's back off from this kind of spaceship takeoff and come back to our natural setting. Let's come back and start with Thoreau. Thoreau is the natural man. At the end of his winter walk, he writes about the condition that used to be frequent in the early days of the Republic of being snowed in so that one could literally not leave your cabin. And not only would the snowdrifts block the door, but it would block the windows. So that the only way that you could look out of a cabin in primordial New England in the midst of a winter snowdrift was to go to the fireplace and look up through the chimney and see a spot of sky. That was the Tao that Thoreau understood that allowed for him to integrate all of nature into a cosmos. Here's how he records it in A Winter Walk, right at the end of his walk. Though winter is represented in the almanac as an old man facing the wind and sleet and drawing his cloak about him, we rather think of him as a merry woodchopper and warm-blooded youth, as blithe as summer. The unexplored grandeur of the storm keeps up the spirits of the traveler. It does not trifle with us, but has a sweet earnestness. In winter, we lead a more inward life. Our hearts are warm and cheery, like cottages under drifts, whose windows and doors are half concealed, but from whose chimneys the smoke cheerfully ascends. The imprisoning drifts, increasing the sense of comfort which the house affords. And in the coldest days we are content to sit over the hearth and see the sky through the chimney top, enjoying the quiet and serene life that may be had in a warm corner by the chimney side, or feeling our pulse by listening to the low of cattle in the street, or the sound of the flail in distant barns in the long afternoon. No doubt a skillful physician could determine our health by observing how these simple and natural sounds affected us. We enjoy now not an oriental, but a boreal leisure around warm stoves and fireplaces, and watch the shadows of motes in the sunbeams. Now, it's been a long time since Americans were used to watching the shadows of motes and sunbeams, but we can get back to that. We can re-inhabit that sacred space. And that's our contribution to planetary culture, is to bring that prescience of nature back into its pragmatic play. This education is sort of a 20th century Thoreau example of that. The double zero, the space at the beginning and the space in the middle, when they are left, even though we come to a purpose, even though we come to a completion, the purpose, the completion, contains enfolded within it, within its integration of finite, arranged sets of actualities, enfolded within all that is the infinite in a secret way. Now let me say this much easier. The whole first year, the whole first circle of our education, the clockwise rotation, is to make an integration, to pull together, to pull our experience together to a single focus, to a what we would call, and what we do call, a realization. A moment, a point of ultimate realization without which one has no basis upon which to differentiate with any accuracy. And without accurate differentiation, consciousness does not occur. Only surrogates, only pretenders of consciousness. But the pretenders, the surrogates, are unable to affect the two most important achievements in the differential mode: the actual existential occurrence of the person and the actual universal manifestation of the cosmos. So that the ultimate aims of an education are to establish the character of the person and the consciousness of the universe. And that character and that consciousness are both, as a pair, dependent upon the realization that is achieved through integration. So the first responsibility of an education is to make sure that a double process is happening. The first process is that integration is happening, and the second, that the field of inquiry which is being integrated is as rich as possible. And so in our first year, as we go along, we're both pulling things together, integrating, and also enriching the field of inquiry. Now, an educational process which does not do both of these at the same time is actually ineffective. And like an ineffective education produces phoniness. Phony persons, egotistical masks parading in melodramas that have no real significance, and false views of the world. Neurotic Weltanschauungs that give us nightmares and endless anxiety. The way to obviate the false person and the bogus world is to make sure that realization actually occurs as the nub of an enriched integration field. Now, in order to do this, we are helping ourselves by using a number of techniques which have been developed in the human heritage and which have been assembled and brought here together in this education and woven together in a single fabric, a single texture of endeavor. And if you will just but follow that endeavor, weave with me as I put this together, by the time of about the third or fourth month of this process, you will begin to imagine all by yourself, without very much encouragement, exactly the quality of experience that is necessary to continue. And as we get towards the end of the first year, you will be able to, for the first time, get an idea of what has happened and what is happening. Somewhere around late October, somewhere around Halloween time, you'll have that capacity. For right now, don't worry about the ideas. The ideas are as powerful as you would wish, even beyond your current imagination. Now, in order to lay a natural field for our inquiry, I want to encourage you to look at two videos which are listed in the program notes. The first is David Attenborough's Life on Earth. David is the brother of Richard Attenborough, who made the films Gandhi and the recent one with Anthony Hopkins about C.S. Lewis, The Shadowlands. David narrates this, and this is a series of 13 video lectures, all put onto one series of double tapes. And you can either rent this through a video store near your neighborhood, or when we get our VCR working again, you can view it here some Saturday after class. Life on Earth brings this whole cycle of animals and plants of this particular planet into a integrated, unfolding pattern. And I think that he's done a very good job. Because of the rather large scope of nature in our time, life on Earth is not sufficient to generate a field of inquiry large enough and rich enough to be integrated to the power of realization which we actually need to obtain. So we have to enlarge ourselves beyond this world, beyond life on Earth, beyond this particular planet, to include the entire universe. But we cannot see the universe as a cosmos yet. It's too early in the game. That's for the end of next year. And so this little video, Timothy Ferris, The Creation of the Universe. This little video will help us. This is like the first 3 minutes of creation. And it gives us, he uses a lighthouse and the rise and the spiral steps of the lighthouse as an indication. As we go up the spiral steps of the lighthouse and look out the windows, we see every millisecond in the creation of the universe the new conditions that obtain in this wondrous explosion of creation. And so the creation of the universe tells us about how atoms formed, how molecules formed, how particles formed, and their sequence in a cardinal evolutionary scale. These two videos together, and I would suggest that the tried and true wise approach is to see them several times. See them once to get acquainted, see them a second time for a comparative reference, and optimally see them a third time to focus in and really appreciate what's being done there. Much like your walks, your 3 walks. The first walk simply occurs. The second walk has the experience of the second walk because there's a differential between the second and the first. And the third walk gives you the first form. And this is a universal principle. The 1, the 2, and the 3. The 1 occurs without another, without any other. And so oneness, when it occurs, is not noticeable. All the great mystics of the world and every religious discipline have experienced a mystical oneness, the oceanic feeling. One of the better descriptions, Aldous Huxley in The Perennial Philosophy talks about the mystics coming to a point of an oceanic oneness with everything. D.T. Suzuki, the great Japanese Zen master, when he had his moment of oneness, he came out of the Zendo. He was 20 years of age, and he was startled to see that all the trees were transparent, and he looked down at his own body and he saw it was transparent also. The great Russian poet Yevtushenko, when he had his great mystical experience in the bowels of the hydroelectric station Bratskaya outside of Irkutsk in Siberia on the Angara River, and this torrential waterfall plunge of the entire Angara River, turning these turbos that never stopped and hummed in a humming vibration that filled the entire hydroelectro plant and also his own body. And the only word that came to him translates as everything. Everything, 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 everything. That kind of mystical openness to oneness demonstrates to us in the most pragmatic, practical way that oneness cannot be noticed. Oneness characterizes existence, but existence cannot be thought about when one is existing. In order to notice existence, one has to move one bit away. One bit, one step, 1 degree, 1 level, one something or other. The ancient human way of doing this is to make a ritual movement. And by the first ritual movement, one breaks the unity of existence and releases the initial step in the dance of experience. Experience occurs out of existence. An existence because of its oneness it could not be noticed, but in experience because of the two-ness we now can notice not only the existence and wonder what it was and marvel at what it is, but at the same time recognize that our experience now is needing, because it is different from existence, needing to be matched up, rematched with existence. And on the most primordial level possible, an education which does not provide for its students the chance to observe the beginnings of experience and the primordial need to match experience to the oneness of existence is a bogus education. It is not worth supporting by funds, by public monies or private monies. by buildings, by texts, by anything else. Because without this initiality, there is no possibility of the student coming to understand meaning. And we get what we have today. A bunch of thugs parading as children. An educational system that's a meat grinder for the culture that we have. If it goes unchecked, it'll be destroyed within a generation. In the most basic primordial way, experience must actually happen. But an experience which is so mixed, mucked up, mulched with the mystery of existence, so that experience cannot be recognized. One could never learn from experience. One could never grow such experience, as they say in the Clinton administration. One could never grow experience like that. You could not expand experience. And so the primordial responsibilities we will see of rituals is to ensure that culture happens. And culture is the pattern of experience. Now we're going to go way beyond culture. We're going to rise to such exponential powers beyond culture that it will indeed seem what the 19th century anthropologists called primitive. But I urge you not to use the term primitive, but to use the term primordial, for it must never be thrown away. And we cannot go 1 centimeter above the ritual level until we have accomplished that level. And that level, that ritual experience, comes out of the existence which is there in nature, but unnoticeable. The great French anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl used a term, my French pronunciation is always off, so I pronounce it in an English way, participation mystical. Participation mystique. He says that primordial man, or primitive man, was so much into participating mystically in nature that consciousness, as we would call it, never occurred in him. And this is quite accurate, except for one provision. Consciousness is always there, it's just not in the numerator, it's in the denominator. Because in the ratio of the real, one is never dealing just simply with something. One is always dealing with a ratio. Something over something. So if one is writing existence in terms of experience, you never write 1, but you always write 1 over 1. So that there is an emotional certainty of security in being a part of something else. And there is concomitantly, that at the same time, an emotional insecurity in being just yourself, of not being a part. And so cultures necessarily breed security in groups where everyone is a fraction of the whole, and are loath, are fearful of becoming whole in themselves. And so one of the startling facts of reality that have to be faced is that cultures do not permit individual persons to occur. They do not suffer them very well. They kill them off. And by having a scrambled situation as we have today, where all of the civilized pressure is to be an individual person in a regressive cultural situation where people are fearful of that very thing and need to cluster together into groups, this is the origin of the need to be in a gang and the way that the gang seeks to scapegoat and kill the person who's not a part of the gang. It is a primordial sociological phenomenon which can be traced back exactly to this condition. This is the atomic nuts and bolts of a sociological problem which is now worldwide and which is never going to go away by giving them castor oil, by counseling them, by putting them in jail, by threatening them. Because all of these techniques simply unify the group in their determination to get rid of the outsiders. Now we have to be intelligent about the situation or it's going to get the best of us. This education is the way out on an individual scale, on a massive scale, the size of the United States, not a planetary scale. This is the way to deal with the entire pattern of problems in a unified matrix and to bring not adjustment but cure into the human family. Notice here that nature, when it occurs, is zero-based. It's only with ritual that we begin to get a sense, because of the two-ness, because of the pairedness, because we're outside now the one. It's only in pairedness, it's only in polarity that we generate the quality of experience that allows us to recognize for the very first time that existence happens. And so we get an offset. We get a one-stage offset, which is extremely important. It's this offset that is the founding of the ratio. Nature is always then the denominator, and experience is always the numerator. So one says very simply, my experience in nature leads me to such and such a judgment, such and such a conclusion. And so whenever we find ourselves moving, being mobile in nature, it indicates that already that ratio of the real has registered in us. We're already there. In a child, in a baby, when the baby begins to respond to someone else, that initial step is already taken. A baby laying on its back, having its diapers changed, that smiles up at the mother's face, the mother's eyes looking at it, has already entered into the ritual level, has already left nature, has already left the zero base and is in the oneness. Already. And so it happens very early on. It's like, as we will see in Timothy Ferris's Creation of the Universe, it doesn't take very long at all for atoms to form in the creation of the universe. But we need to know what happens before the atoms occur, before they form. Because if we begin counting from one, we will forever be stymied. Nature will never occur to us in its full mysteriousness, and our integration later on will never be a realization accurate enough to lead to enlightenment, to lead to the realization point, which is necessary, the compression of absorption, which is necessary for consciousness to occur consciously. there will be no persons, and there will be no cosmos. But fortunately, the nature of the real is very peculiar. All it takes is one. All it takes is one real person, and everything is finished. Everything is done. Because one person can teach someone else, and that process can go on indefinitely. It may take some time in terms of the world, but if there is one person conscious ever, anywhere, eventually that entire planet is enlightened. It's just a question then of work, rolling up the sleeves and getting to work, and figuring out how to do it, making the tools necessary, picking up the dedication that's required, and setting to work. This is the Old Bodhisattva Ideal. It's important that the zero base of nature be allowed to be mysterious, not be forced to be prematurely identified, because the premature compelling of nature to be identified veils the mystery, veils its true nature, and throws us automatically in the need to make the oneness some kind of objectivity which it cannot be. Oneness cannot be objectified until experience enters into the picture, until two-ness occurs. Now, this whole quality of recognizing that the zero occurs and letting it be mysterious, letting it operate but not taking it into a tabulation account. Recognizing, yes, it's operating, but we're not going to tab it. We're not going to tabulate it. So that our calculations include zero as an exponential power horizon indicator, but do not enter into the computation of the cardinal sequencing. Such as the very simple ratio of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and when we get to 9, we come back to 1, but bring the 0 now into play. And so the 10 is a 1 with the 0 included, and then we get to what is called a higher level on the base of 10. We calibrate today, everywhere on this planet, consciously, power in terms of increases of levels of tens. One says in nuclear physics that such and such a K meson occurs at 10 to the minus 36th power in a bevitron. We use the 0 as an exponential ordering of power because we understand that this kind of calculation bites into the reality of a finite world and an infinite mystery together. And both the mystery is preserved and the world is preserved. So 0 is there, but don't count it. That's the simple way. 0 is there, but don't count it. When you begin counting with 1, already you have a pair. But in order to not make the pair match, like having 0 next to 1, in which case you would get an expression of 0, 1, and you would think it's a 0.01. Or if you put the 0 after the 1, you think it's 10. You can't do that. So one of the easiest ways to do it, doing a modification of the old Tolstoy, who in his last diary finally came to a satisfactory expression of God. He tried for 82 years to try and find an expression of God, and in his last diary he wrote, "I have finally today realized that I can write x over 0 and mean God and know what I mean." And so the first pair that's workable in the universe is 1 over 0, the ratio of 1 over 0. And as we will find out later on, in logical operations, in all logical operations, infinity can be substituted for zero in any expression in which it occurs, and the logical structure remains sound. That the cosmos is 1 over infinity is as certain as you sitting here. And the truthfulness of that statement is all founded on the equally certain quality that nature is a 1 over 0 mystery. Now the 1 over 0 allows for the mystery of 0 to be preserved and respected, given its sacredness. But it also allows for the oneness occur, and when that oneness occurs, a finite world is possible, a world of atoms and molecules, a world of elements and cells is possible, not just probable, but possible in the sense that its existentiality is a certainty. The world is not an illusion, but the supposition that the world is not an illusion without enlightenment is itself an illusion. And there's all the difference in the world between someone who pretends to know and someone who knows. As Herman Melville observed in Moby Dick, he said, I have the opportunity to sail around the world and to be paid for it, and that there's all the difference in the world between paying and being paid. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. This is the 4th week, and so next week being the 5th week, every 4 weeks, every month in this cycle, we change our set of books. We get a new pair of books next week to work with for another month. The I Ching and the Portable Thoreau we worked with the first month, and we're not throwing them away, and we're not setting them aside, but we're setting them down and taking up the next pair. And the next pair are the Tao of Physics, Fridtjof Capra, and I think there's a 3rd edition now after this in a smaller paperback. The Tao of Physics, and the book by Timothy Ferris called Galaxies, which is in paperback. Galaxies came out in 1975, and it was published by the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is dedicated to preserving wilderness for the spirit of man. And when the Sierra Club moved larger than the planet and even the star system and got into galaxies, it was an indication to me it's time to come back to the United States and get to work. So I have here the pair of books, and you can get the paper version of Galaxies and the updated version of Tao of Physics. This pair of books, and remember a little colloquial image, you can't score unless you go through the goalposts. The pairs are meant to go through, but you have nowhere to go through. There's nowhere to go until the pairs are established. So we establish the pairs not because they're something in and of themselves. They are, but that's not the whole issue. The issue is that they establish a threshold through which one can go. The Chinese call this kind of threshold a gate. A gate. And later on, in the days of the illustrious son of a Greek-Chinese princess, Kumarajiva, he used to say, adopting the old Taoist gate idea, he used to say of Buddhist enlightenment that when one crosses the Buddha's gate, one enters into inconceivable wisdom. And it was a way of utilizing a very powerful concept, which starts out not being a concept, but by being an image, of a gateway which is based upon the existential primordiality of pairs. Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching says, of this world, the deepest thing that one can say is that it occurs in pairs. Many higher levels of mathematics are impossible unless one can assume the functioning practicality of pairedness. It's absolutely essential. So the next pair of texts, the Tao of Physics and Galaxies, and you can, I hope that you will find them. Speaking about pairs brings us to the Odyssey, where we're reading either Moby Dick or the Odyssey in small increments. Every week, 3 or 4 pages. And as we do this, as we rotate ourselves through either of these journeys, and together they constitute a pair of journeys, a masculine way of journeying, Moby Dick, a feminine way of journeying, the Odyssey. As we calibrate our ritual reading activity through a whole year on either one of these journeys, that functions as a synthesizing base, as a substrate. Now, you can't have any metabolic structures without a substrate. You have to have a substrate. So please try and do this. If you can only each week read the first word of each section, that's better than not doing nothing. That's bad grammar, and the grammar's as bad as the practice, because it shows that you're not investing your dedication into your education. I know this stuff. I don't need to do it again. Try it. Try it. It's amazing, because when you get a substrate, you get something happening. And when it happens, it starts to change everything. Nobody needs to tell you then to keep at it. You'll do it yourself. But you do need to be encouraged to start. The reading in the Odyssey this coming week, section which is in Book 2, starting with line 208 in the Odyssey. And I thought I would just bring in this mysterious divinatory happening that precedes this section. Odysseus is away at Troy for 10 years, besieging that high-flung citadel, and after it falls, it takes 10 years of wanderings trying to get back home. He's gone for 20 years. And in the meantime, a whole generation of people have grown up who didn't know Odysseus, didn't recognize the integrity and strength of the king, and laid siege to his kingdom, not to take it by force of arms, but by winning the hand of his wife, Penelope. And Penelope is always called in Homer circumspect Penelope. She sees full circle. And her very name is balance. Penelope. She is balanced, and in the Odyssey, she weaves by day and unweaves by night, so that her tapestry is always in equanimity, and not one image further is created until her Odysseus comes back to her. But the suitors, who number about 105 men, have filled Odysseus' palace, eating up his food, pinching the slave girls, bullying the old slave men, the thing that suitors always do. And in the meantime, Odysseus' own son Telemachus has grown up. He was just a baby when he left, and Telemachus is now approaching 21, the time when a young man begins to try to size himself up, and the only reality he's had to size himself against is his mother's equanimity. And for a young man, he needs to get out of the equanimity of the mother, out of the equanimity of the feminine, to have adventures, to be able to deal with the struggle of experience. Because the mother secures existence. But there is no experience available until one leaves the mother. Both the daughter and the son need to leave the mother. Sophocles' Electra is all about a daughter who cannot leave the mother, and the mother is a vicious nightmare she cannot wake up from. In the Greek, Electra means Electra. It means unwedded. She cannot pair on her own because she's immersed in the existence of the mother, which is a corrosive nightmare to her, and she cannot get out. Telemachus is the masculine who's immersed in the mother's equanimity. The mother must maintain an absolute perfect equanimity. She's maintaining the space of openness so that Odysseus can have some place to come back to. The openness he left at the beginning is still there. The openness in the middle, 10 years at Troy, 10 years wandering. When Troy fell, the news came, she kept the opening that he left open and there. And the suitors are trying to prematurely force the closure of the circle. They want to come into her. As soon as one of the suitors takes Penelope as his own, that space will have been filled by another, and it will forever destroy the pattern that's necessary for a royal life. One of the great images in the Odyssey, when Odysseus does come home in disguise, and he presents himself to Penelope and takes off his disguise, and she looks at this thorny old warrior who has come back, and she says, "It's been 20 years. I cannot see the man who went away in the man who stands here before me." And she signals the servants to set their marriage bed out into the hall. She'll check him out in the morning. And he finally loses his temper. He says, "When I took you as my bride, I took an old olive tree and honed it down and made that olive tree the post of our bed. Has someone cut my tree so that the bed can be moved?" And then she knows it's him. This is the section where the young Telemachus is stewing in the necessary equanimity of his mother. In the midst of this, he sees in the suitors, the oldest of the suitors is beginning to have qualms about the situation. He's an old man, and he's very good at divination. And he sees a pair of eagles flying in the sky over Ithaca, in that pale, bright azure of the South Adriatic, where those islands like Ithaca occur. And as the eagles fly in a pair, wing to wing, Homer says, and they come over the palace area of Ithaca, they suddenly turn on each other and begin with their beaks trying to scratch the neck of each other. And in confusion and tumble, they fly off. And the old divinatory suitor says, "There, I am not untested in augury." Augury is the initial divination by birds. He says, "There it is. There is the sign that Odysseus is on his way, and he's already hatching in his mind the plan to kill the suitors. We better clear out." Here's how Homer writes it in Richmond Lattimore's translation, just a few lines. Telemachus says, "Then if I hear my father is alive and on his way home, then hard-pressed though I be, I will still hold out for another year. But if I hear he has died and lives no longer, then I will make my way home to the beloved land of my fathers and pile up a tomb in his honor, and there make sacrifices in great amount, as is fitting, and give my mother to a new husband." So he spoke, and sat down again, and among them rose up Mentor, who had once been the companion of stately Odysseus. And Mentor will ask for a ship, and the ship is supposed to carry him off to Ithaca. Now, this quality of the pair of eagles turning on each other, of Telemachus beginning to realize that the crunch is coming, that he will have to, when he becomes mature, either fight the suitors himself to claim his inheritance from his father, or he will have to voluntarily give his mother away to a new husband because he's not strong enough to fight all of the suitors. It's the boy's estimation of what is real in the struggle. The boy will size up the quantity of the opposition and draw the conclusion that he cannot win. Whereas the mature man, like Odysseus, will size up the reality of one's position and pit that against the circumstance, no matter what the quantity is. For when Odysseus comes back and Telemachus says, "But father, there are too many. Even though you have returned, it's too late. There are 105 of them." And Odysseus says, "My son, we will have allies when we fight them." And Telemachus will say, "What allies?" And Odysseus says, "Gray-eyed Athena will be with you and me when we go in and lock the doors and take on the suitors." And Telemachus says, "But father, those are myths." And Odysseus says, "Son, I've come back just in time to open your eyes. She will be there with us if we are there." This whole transition, which wisdom always insists is real, must be made. The movement away from considering that wisdom is just mythic, it's just simply a story that people used to tell to comfort themselves, to quiet down themselves because they didn't know any better. And now that we know better, we can size up the opposition to our struggle and see that sometimes we're outdistanced and we better kowtow. Turn it over to somebody else. It's this kind of immaturity that has ruined civilization and has thrown especially the United States back into some kind of European mess that was extricated hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Kind of dark ages of pessimistic immaturity. In the Chinese tradition, the transition from a mythic cycle, which is no longer believed, of reclaiming that by bringing that mythic cycle together into a symbolic pattern of realization, is the way in which the very origins of the I Ching occurred. There are 3 lines that make up the trigrams and a pair of trigrams that make up the hexagrams. And the I Ching is the cycle of 64 hexagrams, all the permutations that happen. When the ratio of the upper trigram over the lower trigram, the denominator of the lower trigram with the numerator of the upper trigram, each hexagram is a ratio of the real. But the fount upon which the hexagrams occur is the 8 trigrams which go to make them up. The first question, why are there 3? If there's just yin and yang, all right, there's an unbroken line for yang and a broken line for yin. That's 2 lines. How do you get 3? You get 3 because when there's a pairedness, the third aspect is the openness in between them. In Taoism, there's always the 3-value logic. There's true, there's false, and there's neutral. Because there's not only yin and yang, but there's also Tao. Why are there 8 trigrams? Because when you have 3 lines, the permutations of 0 and 1 make a matrix of 8. And it confirms, it cinches itself in the ancient Chinese practice of 8 families locating themselves around a central interior well. 8 farmhouses clustered around a single well was the primordial way in which Chinese culture organized itself tens of thousands of years ago. And we talked last week about how the well, the openness of the well, was transposed to the openness of the family food cauldron, the ting. And so when the Chinese family gathers to eat together around the central bowl of nourishment, it's the primordial image of wholeness. And the Tao in Chinese civilization has been carried by the family meal down through millennia and is undisturbed today. You go to any Chinese restaurant where Chinese people eat, anywhere in the world, and you gather there at supper time or lunchtime, you will see the comfort, the security, the camaraderie, the flow of a vital life process by the people gathered around. And usually the Chinese will have a round table which will seat a number of people. In ancient times it was 8, today it's 10 because of the way that earth is doubled twice. The 5th quality, the middle quality, is doubled twice. When the Taoist myth was told of how the trigrams happened, this is how it was told. Each of the 8 trigrams was an image of some primordial step in a natural process. One of the most natural processes known to man is rain. Without rain, there's no cycling of water, there's no continuance of life. And so a rainstorm is one of the most primordial processes that there is on this particular planet. I should think on almost any planet. If you do not have a way to cycle the substrate of the life process, water in our case, there is no life. And so a rainstorm is the functioning ecology of truth, of what is veritable, of what is real for us. The Chinese Taoists give this kind of rendition. Let me read from my book on the I Ching and just deliver it this way. The trigrams in the Zhou dynasty changed from being heaven-oriented to being man-oriented. Fuxi has the pattern of heaven, and in the Zhou dynasty, some 2,000 years later, a whole aeon later, King Wen and the Duke of Zhou transpose it from a heaven-based ecology to a man-based ecology. Man in the sense of his family structure. Remember the ecology in nature, where I told you that the very first image, the very first occurrence in a rainstorm is that the wind rises. The rising wind is the primordial way in which the Chinese will talk about change, about transformation. When Mao Zedong was trying to alert the Chinese peasants in the early 1920s that there was a change in Chinese history coming, he used the image of wind in the tower, and all of the illiterate Chinese peasants understood what he was talking about. The rising wind is so indelible that even to this day, even persons who ostensibly should have been talking about European dialectics put it in a traditional Chinese manner, Taoist manner. The wind rising, so that the first trigram that records is that of wind. In the Gospel of John, Nicodemus asking about what is real, what is life. And Jesus says, the wind bloweth where it will. Where it comes from and whither it goes, no man knows. But that it's blowing, we all know. So the wind rises. And this is the way in which stillness transforms into movement. So that the Tao transfers into Te. So wind rising. The wind is the beginning of that natural ecology, and the wind engenders then thunder. So thunder is the second. And from thunder comes lightning. And from lightning then rain, the water. The water collects and becomes a lake. And when the water is collected and one sees the lake, in the lake, when water is collected enough to make a lake, one can see a reflection. And what do you see in the reflection? You see the mountain. And having seen the lake and the mountain, one recognizes, here's the lake and the mountain. One puts the gestalt together of the earth. And having realized the earth, one is then aware that the earth is surrounded by the heavens. And the heavens, looking up, one sees that's where the wind comes from. So in this little vignette, this little eightfold vignette, one has the whole cycle of the trigrams presented in the mythic image of a natural function, a rainstorm. Now, Chinese wisdom is like this. It's not at all rationalistic in terms of, say, a Cartesian European prejudice. Not at all. It has nothing to do with that. And academicians who are trained in that kind of analytical school do not understand Tao at all. In fact, most Chinese, trained in a kind of a Marxist dialectic, have no understanding of it whatsoever. And most of the exile communities of Chinese are being cut off from their civilization and taking on chameleon-like the civilization around them, have no idea. There are very few Chinese in Hong Kong who have any idea about the Tao. The only man in Singapore who understood Tao was Lee Kuan Yin, who ran the city. Other than that, they're all just European businessmen. But the Tao is very, very important. Because to understand the way in which nature, through a ritual comportment, can be talked about in a language capable of being symbolized to the point of a focus, is the entire cycle of integration. And once one knows that, one has the secret. So profound is it that the Tao of physics, as we will see, shows that the Tao understanding, not as a model, not as an intellectual model, but as an understanding, functions very adequate in high energy nuclear physics and in modern mathematics. So much so that the family crest of the greatest physicist of the 20th century, Niels Bohr, bears the Tai Chi, the Tao symbol. He put it right on the family crest. Because it is fundamental, it is primordial. And so in understanding the I Ching somewhat, we get not only an insight, but we get the ecology of the completed pattern to act as a substrate to allow us to make the fundamental transformations that are necessary to participate in nature as a matrix of change without any static there-ness whatsoever, in its transition to the Te of existence where ritual actually happens and the first objectivity occurs in human life, to that second transformation where language functions like nature as a transformational medium. And just like ritual objectivity comes out of nature and is real, what we do happens. Language allows for a transform to happen also, and symbols come out of it, and the symbols also happen. Symbols are as real as actions. And if you want to power up the kind of pragmatism that characterizes, and did characterize in this particular country, the American genius on the level of William James and John Dewey, the second most popular figure in China in the 1920s was John Dewey. Before there was a Karl Marx, there was a John Dewey in China. They invited Dewey to go there in 1921, and he was lionized in China before the communists took over. And almost all of the communists, those who became communists in the 1920s, were American pragmatists. But they couldn't get anyone to listen to them in the United States, except just a few people. When Dewey came back from China after spending a year or so there, he wrote a book called Experience in Nature, which is one of the classics of American Taoism. Paul Karras lectures in Chicago. If you want to get really pragmatic about life, you have to understand that what you do is real, and that symbols, what you think, is also objectively real. What occurs in the mind is as real as what is done with the hands. And if you're going to be realistic about life, you have to realize that what you think is linked with, objectively, what you do. So that most wonderful of little gnomic teachers, Jacob Bernowski, used a wonderful phrase in his series, The Ascent of Man. He said, the hand is the cutting edge of the mind. And when you can coordinate what you can do with your hands with what you can think with your mind, then man gains a handle on his capacities. Then his facility to be who he is emerges because he can pull it all together. Integration depends upon actions in ritual comportment and the mind in symbol making to be coordinated. And when they are coordinated together, equally in equanimity, you bring nature and language, the natural zero-based matrix, and the mythic cycle of language along with them. And when those two great wheels of the metaphorical chariot of wisdom, when the wheel of nature and the wheel of mythic language are together, then you have a kind of a mobility that allows for you to focus. Then one becomes the driver of the chariot, positioned equally between the two wheels. Then you become the driver. Then integration is possible to the point of realization. Then consciousness is possible. Then human persons are not far behind. They are possible. And a cosmos is also possible. All good things come out of this. In order for the trigrams to have this circulation, there has to be a movement. And to the Chinese Taoists, the movement is always a rising, like the wind rising. So that when you have the trigrams, you have this kind of a condition. In the first trigram, you begin with with a broken line, with a yin line at the bottom, in order to differentiate that this is a yin line that you're talking about. The top two lines are unbroken, yang. So the first trigram is like a gateway that has two bars over it, two yang lines, and then a broken line where one can go through. Later on, the symbol becomes refined in Japan as the Torii Gate. The Torii Gate is not just a Shinto emblem, but it is also an East Asian Tao symbol, that this is the beginning of the process of how the real occurs. And so a Torii Gate is the perfect symbol of the beginning of that process. It's the first trigram. The yin line on the bottom, two yang lines on top of it. And then look here. The only way to symbolically indicate that there's a rising is to let the yin line at the bottom rise, and it rises to the middle. So the second trigram has the broken line in between the two, sandwiched in between the two yang lines. And then it rises further and becomes the top line. Now the yin line is at the top. You have the image of the cup, the bowl. So look how simple it is. You have a yin line which is at the bottom. It registers in the first place. It registers in the second place. Then it registers in the third place. Notice the principle here, that movement, in order to be real, must register. So that the images are the registration of the reality of the movement. So the first three trigrams are the movement of the yin line rising. It registers in the first place, in the second place, in the top. At the beginning, at the middle, at the end. That's the mythic cycle. The beginning, the middle, the end. But because one is recognizing that all three of these stages of movement are of the same movement, a single movement, one then abstracts out the three yin lines and puts them together, and so you get three yin lines together. You take the first, the second, and the third place yin lines and take them out of their context and put them together to form a pure trigram. Kun, the receptive. The same process happens with the yang line. The first yang is a yang line on the bottom and two yin lines on top. And the second registry, the yang line in the middle, the third, the yang line on the top. And the fourth trigram, abstracting out the three yang lines in their registry, and so you have Qin, the creative. Notice how just with yin and yang, in a functioning which includes Tao as the neutral third, one generates the 8 trigrams, which are united together by this simple description of a rainstorm. Notice how pure, how refined, how simple, how elegant Taoism is. That it's not at all a cluttered up, complicated erudition. Its erudition is in its fantastic simplicity. Now, someone who clouds this up simply does not understand, is unable to live it. It is as purely simple as is possible. Lao Tzu says, the wise man is like a newborn baby. When it smiles, the whole world is happy. This quality of the Tao, which allows for the movement of yin and yang through their registry, through the 2 fours, a pair of quaternaries, a pair of fours, making together an 8-fold infinity sign continuity. So that the 8 trigrams together, in the ecology of their movement, are an expression of the eternal, of infinity. Infinity cannot be, where are our notes? Infinity cannot be integrated. I guess my page of notes is here. Infinity is not integrable. In other words, when our first year of education is completed, we will not know that infinity was there because it cannot be integrated. It cannot be. But it will be integrated if we allow the mystery of nature to be with us all the way and without us compulsory needing to label the damn thing. You can't write out mystery on a sheet of paper and paste it on nature and expect it to stick. A mystery is a mystery because you let it be. You let it alone. It's like what Psyche learns in the myth of Cupid and Psyche. She learns not to question love. Only then is it real. The minute you start questioning, you wonder, is your lover real? And as soon as you begin to investigate, it's all skewed. It all goes away. It's not real. It's no longer there. So life, love, they are mysteries that must be allowed to be what they are. They cannot be categorized. They cannot be labeled. And they must be allowed to circulate in their own way, in their own mysterious way. But this does not obviate our ability to make definite registry of actions, of finiteness, of stages, of steps, of making form possible. And we will see that the world occurs because the mystery allows for the registry of form to occur within a background that does not register. So these 8 trigrams are the movement of simultaneously the yin and the yang through a quaternary, through a 4-part registry of actuality, so that each trigram registers and has a ritual existence. And out of that ritual existence has a mythic or a language meaning, has an experience meaning which can be brought forth. And that meaning is of such a nature that it can be symbolized. If the ritual has come out of nature in a primordial way, then the symbol will come out of the meaning in a like primordial way. And just as the pragmatic actuality of actions really occurs, the symbols will also be equally pragmatically real. This is the confidence of the wisdom tradition, is what one would like to say absolutely true, perfectly real. One can have confidence to any degree of requisition that this is so. When the symbols are real, it means that the integration of the sets is actual and realization is expected. Next week, when we come to the Tao of physics and galaxies, we're going to take the very large and the very small as a pair in nature. The atomic particle universe and the galactic cluster universe together as a pair. And by pairing them in a ratio, we will see that astronomy and physics, nuclear physics and extragalactic astronomy together form a ratio of the real, a quality of nature which we need. We need that expansiveness of the matrix of nature in order to integrate the quality of persons necessary to live real lives in the cosmos which is now possible. That this is new needs to be stressed. As Frank Lloyd Wright once said, he said, if the Greeks had had glass and steel and concrete, we wouldn't have to do any thinking in architecture. We'd build like they built. But we have new materials. We do have glass and steel and concrete, and so we have to learn to build primordially from the Tao again to factor these new materials in. Well, we have new materials in the hopper. There were no human beings before us who had any idea about galaxies. The Hubble Atlas of Galaxies is made by Edwin Hubble, the man who here in Los Angeles, up on Mount Wilson, first determined the actuality of galaxies and made the first map of galaxies, the first atlas. This was done in the 1930s and was not in general consciousness until after the Second World War. Up until then, no one had any idea of the expanse. But it wasn't until the 1960s, about 1966, an astronomer named Martin Schmidt, who identified quasars for the first time as very distant proto-galactic structures. And we began to realize that the universe that we live in is of an enormity that staggers imagination. Notice this, imagination, which developed on a cultural basis on this planet for millennium, is unable to conceive of the actuality. That actuality can only be conceived in a consciousness which is honed and taught and educated to the point to where symbols are as powerful as actions. And to children who learn to think with the confidence that their thoughts are as real as what they do, they will be able to envision the actuality, the pragmatic practicality of the home in which they now inhabit. The size of our house should have been realized before. God's house has a mansion of many rooms, and now we recognize that it's an estate with many mansions. In fact, it's a parkland of many, 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 many realities. This can be expressed even to mathematic specificity, but that anyone can hear that, there are only a handful of people now who could even hear that. Sufficient for us, work at this education bit by bit. Your seal, your guarantee that it will work is your being here. the reoccurrence of your being here is your ritual comportment. The understanding will come later. Promise. It'll be there as certain as if you show up here. Absolutely. It's not my guarantee. It's God's guarantee. Not through me, through you. That's the way it'll happen. Thank you.